The annual summer fete at St. Mary Mead proceeded with the gentle efficiency of a well-rehearsed ritual. Beneath the spreading elm on the vicarage lawn, Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, observing the familiar choreography of village life. The White Elephant stall drew its usual crowd of hopeful bargain hunters, presided over by Mrs. Banbury Scott, whose military bearing suggested she had conquered more than charity sales in her time. "Now here's something rather special," Mrs. Banbury Scott announced, lifting a small leather diary from behind a collection of mismatched teacups. The book was bound in deep blue leather with a silver clasp, its pages pristine and unopened. This belonged to Miss Eleanor Carmichael. Never opened it once, according to her housekeeper. Kept it locked away for 40 years. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. In her experience, unopened diaries suggested secrets too dangerous to record or too precious to share. Mrs. Emmeline Prowse, the village's most dedicated gossip, leaned closer with obvious fascination. 40 years, you say? That would be around the time of that dreadful business with young Timothy Ashworth. Poor Miss Eleanor never seemed quite herself after that tragedy. Tragic indeed, murmured Dr. Fielding, approaching with his wife Iris. The boy was only 21 when that horse threw him. Miss Eleanor had raised him after his parents died. She blamed herself terribly, though there was nothing anyone could have done. Iris Fielding's gloved hand fluttered nervously near her reticule. "Perhaps some things are better left undisturbed," she said quietly, though her eyes remained fixed on the diary with an intensity that Miss Marple found rather interesting. "Nonsense," declared Major Whitcomb, his military mustache bristling with authority. "If the family meant it to remain private, they wouldn't have donated it to the church sale. 5 shillings for the roof fund?" 10, countered Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, Miss Eleanor's great-nephew, who had appeared with surprising suddenness. His usual composure seemed strained, and Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his wallet. The diary should remain in the family, naturally. Mrs. Banbury Scott held the diary protectively. "Perhaps we should ask the vicar what he thinks proper." "I think," said a crisp voice from behind them, "that I should very much like to examine that diary myself." They turned to see Inspector Morrison approaching, his expression unusually grave. "I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing news about Miss Eleanor Carmichael's death. It seems there may have been more to investigate than we initially thought." The cheerful bustle of the fete seemed to falter around them. Miss Marple observed how each face registered the inspector's words differently. Mrs. Prowse's eyes lit with the thrill of scandal, while Iris Fielding grew noticeably paler. Geoffrey Ashworth's jaw tightened, and Major Whitcomb straightened as if preparing for battle. "What sort of investigation?" Dr. Fielding asked, his medical training making him naturally cautious about such pronouncements. "The coroner has raised some questions about the circumstances of her death," Inspector Morrison replied carefully. "Nothing definitive yet, but enough to warrant a closer look at her recent activities and possessions." "Then the diary must certainly not be sold," Geoffrey Ashworth said quickly. "As her heir, I insist it be turned over to the proper authorities immediately." "How convenient," Major Whitcomb muttered, earning a sharp look from Mrs. Banbury Scott. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her attention was entirely focused on the small drama unfolding before her. She had noticed how Geoffrey Ashworth's concern for propriety had emerged only after the inspector's arrival, and how Iris Fielding had unconsciously stepped backward, as if distance might provide protection from unwelcome revelations. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we might ask what poor Miss Eleanor would have wanted. After all, she kept the diary locked for 40 years. That suggests she had very particular feelings about its contents." "Exactly my point," Iris Fielding said with obvious relief. "Some secrets are meant to remain buried." "But secrets have a way of surfacing eventually," Inspector Morrison observed, accepting the diary from Mrs. Banbury Scott's reluctant hands, "particularly when they concern matters of life and death." As the inspector carefully wrapped the diary in his handkerchief, Miss Marple noticed several things that others had missed. She saw how Geoffrey Ashworth's relief at losing possession of the diary contradicted his earlier insistence on claiming it. She observed Iris Fielding's unconscious sigh of relief, and the way Major Whitcomb's bluster had given way to thoughtful silence. Most interesting of all, she had seen the brief moment when Mrs. Prowse had touched the diary's clasp, and the small, satisfied smile that had crossed her features when it remained locked. The fete continued around them, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Conversations became more subdued, and people glanced frequently toward the group around the white elephant stall. The innocent pleasure of the afternoon had been replaced by something more complex and considerably more dangerous. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the serene expression that had served her so well over the years. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that unopened diaries were rather like Pandora's box. The question was not whether they would eventually be opened, but whether anyone would survive the consequences of what lay within. The secret of the unopened diary, she suspected, was about to become very much opened indeed. The summer fete dissolved like watercolors in rain, its cheerful bustle replaced by an undercurrent of whispered speculation. As the last of the bunting was folded away, and the final crumbs swept from trestled tables, the villagers of St. Mary Mead found themselves reluctant to disperse entirely. Inspector Morrison's pronouncement had transformed their peaceful afternoon into something far more intriguing and considerably more unsettling. Miss Marple helped Mrs. Clement gather the remaining tablecloths, her movements unhurried despite the charged atmosphere. Through the gathering dusk, she observed the small clusters of villagers who lingered near the church gate, their voices carrying the particular intensity that accompanied truly scandalous news. Mrs. Emmeline Prowse had positioned herself strategically near the white elephant stall, where she could intercept anyone attempting to leave without proper consultation. "Such a shock about poor Miss Eleanor," she confided to Dr. Fielding, who had paused to retrieve his wife's forgotten gloves. "Though I must say, I always sensed something unresolved about her final weeks. She seemed quite agitated when I visited her last month, muttering about old wrongs and delayed justice." Dr. Fielding's expression grew thoughtful. She did ask some rather unusual questions during her recent consultation, inquiries about old injuries and their potential long-term effects. I found it curious at the time. Across the lawn, Geoffrey Ashworth stood in animated discussion with Major Whitcomb, though Miss Marple noticed how Geoffrey's earlier insistence on claiming the diary had transformed into obvious relief at its confiscation. The contradiction was most illuminating. "No good can come of dragging up the past," Geoffrey was saying, his voice carrying further than he likely intended. "My great-aunt deserves to rest in peace." "Quite right," Major Whitcomb agreed, though his military bearing suggested a man preparing for battle rather than peaceful resolution. "These village gossips will make mountains from molehills. Mark my words, this whole business will prove to be nothing more than an old woman's fancies." Yet Miss Marple observed how both men glanced frequently toward the church, where Inspector Morrison could be seen in earnest conversation with the vicar. Whatever the inspector had discovered in that brief initial examination of the diary, it had been sufficient to warrant immediate action. As the evening deepened, Inspector Morrison made his way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement provided tea with practiced efficiency. The inspector accepted his cup gratefully but made no attempt to drink. His attention focused entirely on the small leather diary before him. The lock proved less formidable than it appeared. He began carefully. "What I found inside was rather unexpected. Miss Eleanor had indeed begun writing in the diary, but only recently. The entries span just the past 6 weeks, and they read rather like careful documentation of conversations and observations." He opened the diary to a marked page. For instance, she recorded detailed notes about her recent visitors. Mrs. Prowse called twice last month, and Miss Eleanor noted her apparent nervousness when discussing Timothy Ashworth's accident. Major Whitcomb visited 3 days ago, and Miss Eleanor observed his anxiety about whether Timothy had confided anything significant before his death. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. How very methodical of her. It suggests she had developed specific suspicions about that old tragedy. Indeed. And according to her housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Eleanor had been speaking frequently of making things right and facing the truth at last. She had also been asking pointed questions about the effects of old head injuries, whether they might cause delayed complications decades later. Dr. Fielding shifted uncomfortably. She did consult me about such matters recently. I assumed it was merely the concern of an elderly person reflecting on past accidents. Perhaps, Inspector Morrison replied. But Mrs. Hartwell also mentioned that Miss Eleanor had been wearing a small blue ribbon around her neck in recent weeks. Something she touched frequently when distressed. We believe it may have held the key to this diary. Through the vicarage windows, the lights of St. Mary Mead began to twinkle in cottage windows, each one representing households where similar conversations were undoubtedly taking place. The village was settling into its evening routine, yet beneath the familiar tranquility lay a growing awareness that their peaceful community harbored secrets from the distant past. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind working as methodically as her needles. Someone in their quiet village had carried the weight of an old secret for 40 years, and that someone had recently felt threatened enough by an elderly woman's suspicions to take drastic action. The unopened diary had finally been opened, revealing not blank pages but carefully documented evidence of a community's buried guilt. As Inspector Morrison prepared to leave, Miss Marple offered a gentle observation. "In my experience, Inspector, people who insist most strongly on leaving the past undisturbed are often those with the most compelling reasons to keep it buried. Miss Eleanor's recent determination to document her suspicions suggests she had moved beyond mere speculation to something approaching certainty." The inspector nodded grimly. "Which may well have cost her life. Tomorrow I shall be conducting formal interviews with everyone mentioned in these diary entries. The truth about Timothy Ashworth's death 40 years ago may finally come to light." Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into darkness, its residents unaware that the peaceful surface of their community was about to be shattered by revelations that someone had killed to keep hidden. The secret of the unopened diary was proving far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The morning after, the fate brought an unusual stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelations to come. Inspector Morrison had established himself in the vicarage study by 8 o'clock, Miss Eleanor's diary positioned precisely on the polished desk, like a small leather witness awaiting its moment of testimony. The inspector's methodical approach to the interviews reflected his understanding that in cases involving long-buried secrets, every detail possessed potential significance. Mrs. Hartwell arrived first, her 30 years of devoted service to Miss Eleanor evident in both her genuine grief and her determination to assist the investigation. As she settled into the chair across from Inspector Morrison, her weathered hands smoothed her apron with the automatic gesture of a woman accustomed to maintaining order, even in chaos. "Mrs. Hartwell," Inspector Morrison began gently, "the diary entries suggest Miss Eleanor had been conducting something of a private investigation in recent weeks. Did you observe any changes in her behavior or routine?" The housekeeper's expression grew troubled. "Indeed I did, Inspector. It began about 6 weeks ago, after she received an anonymous letter. She never showed it to me, but I could see it had disturbed her greatly. After that, she started asking the oddest questions about the past, particularly about young Timothy Ashworth's accident." Miss Marple, who had arrived with a covered dish and remained to assist Mrs. Clement with tea, listened with the quiet attention that had served her so well over the years. The mention of an anonymous letter after 40 years of silence suggested either a guilty conscience finally breaking or new evidence coming to light. Miss Eleanor began documenting her conversations with visitors. Mrs. Hartwell continued. She kept detailed notes about their reactions when Timothy's name was mentioned, recorded inconsistencies in their accounts of that day, and even made sketches of objects people handled nervously during visits. Inspector Morrison consulted his notes. The diary mentions a blue ribbon that Miss Eleanor wore around her neck. "Can you tell me about that?" "Oh, yes. A small silk ribbon with an old key attached. She'd had it for years, but only started wearing it recently, touching it whenever she became agitated. The strangest thing, Inspector, it went missing the day she died. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it among her belongings." The inspector's attention sharpened. "And there were visitors that final evening?" 3 letters sealed with blue wax were on the hall table for posting that night, Mrs. Hartwell replied carefully. But in the morning, only one remained. Miss Eleanor claimed she had reconsidered about the others. There was also a visitor after I retired. I heard the front latch and voices in the drawing room. When I went down later to bank the fire, I caught the scent of saddle soap, which seemed odd since we don't use such things in the house. Geoffrey Ashworth presented himself next, his usual confident demeanor slightly strained. He acknowledged visiting his great-aunt 2 evenings before her death, but denied any knowledge of the missing letters or the late-night visitor. When Inspector Morrison mentioned the saddle soap, Geoffrey's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'd come directly from the solicitor's office that day," he said carefully. "Not from any stables, if that's what you're implying." Miss Marple observed how Geoffrey's relief at the inspector's methodical questioning seemed genuine, the relief of an orderly man who preferred direct accusations to mysterious implications. Yet something in his manner suggested he was grateful for the focus on practical matters rather than deeper secrets. Iris Fielding arrived pale and nervous, her gloved hands clutching a small reticule that bulged awkwardly. She spoke softly of her recent tea visits with Miss Eleanor, mentioning that the elderly woman had asked peculiar questions about a girl named Maisie from years past. "A servant, I believe," Iris said, her voice catching slightly. "I knew nothing of her." When Iris reached for her handkerchief, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something metallic in the reticule, small, rounded, with a fray of blue silk attached. The observation was filed away with the quiet efficiency that had made Miss Marple's reputation. Major Whitcomb arrived with characteristic bluster, dismissing the entire investigation as unnecessary dramatics. However, when questioned about his final visit with Miss Eleanor, his military bearing faltered slightly. "She asked about old regimental matters," he admitted, "and she inquired about a particular whistle I had taught young Timothy. A double note for calling dogs. She seemed to attach some significance to it that I couldn't fathom." Mrs. Prowse, arriving without summons, positioned herself prominently and declared her eagerness to assist. Her account of Miss Eleanor's recent agitation seemed calculated to emphasize the deceased woman's allegedly fragile mental state, though she inadvertently revealed her own detailed knowledge of the diary's contents and the blue ribbon key. By afternoon, Inspector Morrison had compiled a substantial file of testimonies, contradictions, and intriguing details. The evidence pointed most obviously toward Geoffrey Ashworth. He possessed clear financial motive, had been the last known visitor, and stood to inherit considerably from his great-aunt's estate. Miss Eleanor's diary entries documented her growing suspicion of his requests for loans and her intention to revise her will. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very obviousness of the case against Geoffrey. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had learned that the most apparent solution often served to conceal a more complex truth. The blue ribbon's disappearance, the scent of saddle soap, the double whistle's significance, and the various nervous reactions she had observed suggested undercurrents that ran deeper than simple inheritance disputes. As evening approached and the interviews concluded, Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, her mind working as methodically as her needles. Someone in their peaceful village had carried the burden of murder for 40 years, and that someone was now facing exposure through an elderly woman's determined investigation. The question was not merely who had killed Miss Eleanor, but who had killed Timothy Ashworth decades earlier, and why the truth had finally become too dangerous to remain buried. The secret of the unopened diary was revealing itself to be far more complex than anyone had imagined, and Miss Marple suspected the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead with an unusual stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelations yet to come. Inspector Morrison, having concluded his interviews with what he considered satisfactory results, found himself drawn back to Miss Eleanor's cottage in the company of Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Marple, who had volunteered to assist with the practical matter of securing the deceased woman's belongings. The drawing-room retained the faint scent of lavender polish, now threaded with that other smell Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned. The unmistakable aroma of saddle soap that seemed oddly out of place in a household that kept no horses. Inspector Morrison moved methodically through the space, his attention drawn to details that had escaped notice during the initial examination. On the side table, 2 teacups remained precisely as they had been found, one used and one pristine, alongside Miss Eleanor's distinctive green glass that she preferred for her evening barley water. "The letters, are there?" Mrs. Hartwell murmured, gesturing toward the mantelpiece. 3 of them, sealed with blue wax. I remember distinctly because Miss Eleanor stood so long by the fire after sealing the last, as if she were gathering courage for what was to come. Inspector Morrison knelt beside the hearth, his trained eye catching what others had missed. Among the fine grey ash lay several beads of hardened wax, their deep blue color unmistakable even in the dim light. With careful fingers, he extracted a fragment of charred paper from beneath the grate, no more than a thumb's width, with the ghostly impression of ink still visible along one scorched edge. Miss Marple leaned closer with the innocent curiosity that had served her so well over the years. The fragment bore the faintest suggestion of letters, partially obscured by char but still discernible to those who knew how to look. The curved line of what might have been I caught her attention, along with something that resembled the formal script of a business establishment. "One letter reached the vicar safely," Inspector Morrison observed, "but it appears the other 2 met different fates. One burned, perhaps hastily, and another—" He paused, considering the implications. "Another may have been removed by someone who had reason to prevent its delivery." They made their way to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement received them with the grave courtesy that marked his approach to all matters of spiritual and temporal significance. The blue-sealed envelope lay unopened on his study table, and at the inspector's request, he broke the wax with reverent care. The letter within was brief but illuminating. Miss Eleanor's precise handwriting conveyed a sense of urgency that transcended the formal language. "Reverend Clement, in the matter of Timothy, I have been mistaken for many years in whom I chose to trust. I must speak plainly to 3 people, and would be grateful if you would be present when I do so, that there can be no misunderstanding. I've discovered something that explains the whistle and the lane and the horse. If anything prevents my coming, you must ask about the whistle lesson, the ribbon, and Maisie." The silence that followed seemed to echo with unspoken questions. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this new information. The whistle that Major Whitcomb had mentioned so casually, the blue ribbon that had vanished on the night of Miss Eleanor's death, and the mysterious Maisie, whose name had provoked such interesting reactions during the interviews. Inspector Morrison, however, remained focused on the more obvious aspects of the case. Geoffrey Ashworth's financial difficulties, documented so thoroughly in Miss Eleanor's diary, provided both motive and opportunity. The young man's mounting debts and increasingly desperate requests for assistance painted a compelling picture of an heir driven to desperate measures by circumstance. "The evidence against Mr. Ashworth appears quite conclusive," the inspector declared as they returned to the cottage. "His financial pressures, combined with his knowledge of Miss Eleanor's routines and her intention to revise her will, provide clear motive for murder." Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very neatness of this solution. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had learned to be suspicious of cases that resolved themselves too conveniently. Geoffrey's guilt seemed almost theatrical in its obviousness, as if carefully arranged for an audience eager to accept the most apparent explanation. As they prepared to leave Miss Eleanor's cottage, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that others had overlooked. Among the ashes in the fireplace, partially hidden beneath the blue wax beads, lay a fragment of envelope bearing the embossed mark of a stationer's establishment. The words, Hayes and Bent, High Street Market, Belling, were clearly visible despite the charring around the edges. The name stirred a memory in Miss Marple's methodical mind. Hayes was not an uncommon surname, but in the context of their small village, it carried particular significance. She recalled the parish register entry she had once noted regarding Dr. Fielding's marriage to a Margaret Hayes, who had subsequently chosen to be known as Iris. That evening, as the village settled into its accustomed tranquility, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern of behavior she had observed during the interviews. Iris Fielding's obvious distress when certain topics were mentioned, the metallic glint in her reticule, and her peculiar knowledge of details she claimed not to remember, all suggested a woman carrying the weight of dangerous secrets. The blue ribbon and its key had disappeared for a reason that had nothing to do with Geoffrey Ashworth's financial desperation. Someone in their peaceful village had carried the burden of guilt for 40 years, and that someone was now facing exposure through an elderly woman's determined investigation into the past. Miss Marple settled into her evening chair with her knitting, her mind working as methodically as her needles. The obvious solution was often the wrong solution, and in this case, she suspected that Geoffrey Ashworth was serving as a convenient scapegoat for someone whose guilt ran far deeper into the village's buried history. The secret of the unopened diary was revealing itself to be not one mystery, but two, connected by threads of deception that someone had killed twice to keep hidden. Morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows a night of revelation, though Inspector Morrison remained focused on the conventional path his investigation had established. Over breakfast at the vicarage, he spoke with quiet satisfaction about the warrant he would seek for Geoffrey Ashworth's arrest, citing the young man's mounting debts, the matching stationery found in his lodgings, and the convenient presence of saddle soap among his recently acquired riding equipment. The inspector's methodical mind found comfort in such tangible evidence, each piece fitting neatly into the framework of obvious motive and clear opportunity. Miss Marple, who had arrived with a fresh loaf for Mrs. Clement's breakfast table, listened without contradiction while privately noting the inspector's eagerness to close a case that seemed to resolve itself so conveniently. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had learned to be particularly suspicious of solutions that appeared too neat, too obvious, and too satisfying to those who preferred their mysteries solved quickly rather than correctly. "Inspector," she ventured gently, "might it be worthwhile to make inquiries at that stationer's shop in Market Belling? The fragment we found suggests someone in the village has been purchasing their distinctive blue sealing wax quite recently." Inspector Morrison, already mentally composing his report, agreed absently and made a note to dispatch Constable Evans after luncheon. Miss Marple smiled her thanks and suggested, with the innocent helpfulness that had served her so well over the years, that such inquiries were often more productive in the early morning, before the day's customers began crowding a shopkeeper's memory with newer transactions. By 9:30, Miss Marple's neat figure was stepping through the doorway of Hayes and Bent, where the morning light revealed shelves lined with fine papers, elegant writing implements, and an impressive array of sealing wax arranged by color along the right wall. The distinctive blue shade that had hardened in Miss Eleanor's fireplace was unmistakable among the more common reds and blacks, its unusual depth suggesting a customer with particular preferences. The shop assistant, a precise young man with the careful manners of someone who took pride in his expertise, brightened at the prospect of discussing his wares with a knowledgeable customer. Miss Marple admired the fountain pens, inquired about embossed envelopes, and finally observed, almost apologetically, that a dear friend had recommended their blue wax, particularly the shade that so nicely matched a ribbon. "Ah, yes, that particular blue," the assistant replied with obvious pleasure at being consulted as an expert. "We've had only 2 requests for it in recent weeks, which is quite unusual. One purchase was charged to a house account." He glanced at his ledger and hesitated briefly before continuing. "The other customer was a lady who seemed quite concerned about the permanence of the color. She wore pale gloves and a hat with a pheasant feather that tipped rather low over her eyes. She asked specifically for stout envelope paper and sealing wafers to ensure a neat impression, mentioning that her letters must look properly serious." Miss Marple expressed gentle gratitude for his expertise and selected a single stick of the same blue wax, her mind already placing the assistant's description alongside her memory of Iris Fielding's distinctive hat at the village fete. As she walked home through the peaceful morning streets, she paused briefly outside the saddler's shop, where a boy was polishing bridles with energetic circular strokes. The sharp, clean scent of saddle soap filled the air, and Miss Marple reflected on how tenaciously such fragrances clung to clothing, particularly to the gloves and reticules of those who handled treated leather. Her next destination was the village archives, housed in the small room behind the parish hall where Mr. Finch maintained the local records with the devotion of a true scholar. Under the pretense of researching the history of the almshouses, Miss Marple soon guided the conversation toward the old families of the district. "The Hayes family," Mr. Finch mused, adjusting his spectacles as he consulted a genealogical chart. Old Silas Hayes owned the stationer's shop in Market Belling for decades. His sister Margaret was quite well known in these parts, a spirited young woman who married into the Fielding family. She was called Maisie in her youth, particularly by those who knew her during her time in service, before her marriage. A lovely girl by all accounts, though some said she had rather strong opinions about social justice. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern that Miss Marple found both illuminating and deeply troubling. Margaret, Maisie Hayes, had become Mrs. Fielding, mother to the current Dr. Fielding and mother-in-law to Iris. The connection to the mysterious Maisie mentioned in Miss Eleanor's final letter was becoming clearer, though the full implications remained tantalizingly just beyond reach. That afternoon brought an encounter that crystallized Miss Marple's growing suspicions. She found Iris Fielding in her garden, working among the roses with movements that seemed more nervous than purposeful. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries about flowers and weather, but Miss Marple's gentle mention of Timothy Ashworth's accident produced a visible tension in the younger woman's posture. "Such a tragic loss for the village," Miss Marple observed, settling herself on the garden bench with her knitting. Miss Eleanor had become quite preoccupied with it recently. She mentioned something about a whistle and a ribbon in her letter to the vicar, and someone called Maisie. Rather curious details to remember after so many years. Iris Fielding's hands stilled among the rose stems, and Miss Marple noticed how her reticule lay open beside her gardening tools, revealing not only the brass key she had glimpsed before, but also a length of frayed blue silk ribbon. When Iris unconsciously touched her throat at the mention of Timothy's name, Miss Marple understood that she was looking at someone who had once worn that ribbon and key around her neck. Someone who had been close enough to Timothy Ashworth to matter in ways that had never been officially acknowledged. As evening approached and Inspector Morrison prepared his case against Geoffrey Ashworth, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting, her mind working as methodically as her needles. The blue wax from Hayes and Bent lay beside the charred fragment from Miss Eleanor's fireplace, their identical shades confirming what her instincts had already suggested. Someone had indeed purchased that distinctive wax to seal letters that were never meant to reach their destinations, and that someone had been desperate enough to burn evidence and steal keys to prevent an elderly woman's investigation from revealing a truth that had been buried for 40 years. The secret of the unopened diary was revealing itself to be intimately connected to another secret, one that involved not just inheritance and financial desperation, but love, betrayal, and the kind of guilt that could drive someone to kill twice rather than face exposure. Jeffrey Ashworth might provide a convenient solution for those who preferred their mysteries solved quickly, but Miss Marple knew that the real killer was someone who had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very respectability that made suspicion seem impossible. The most dangerous moment in any investigation, she reflected, came not when secrets were successfully buried, but when they finally began to surface. Miss Eleanor's determination to document her suspicions had set in motion a chain of events that would soon force the real murderer to choose between confession and another desperate act of violence. The morning following the evening's revelations brought an unusual stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Inspector Morrison, having spent the night reviewing his evidence against Jeffrey Ashworth, remained confident in his conclusions despite the nagging questions raised by Miss Eleanor's cryptic references to whistles, ribbons, and the mysterious Maisie. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the very neatness of the case against the young man, her instincts warning her that the most obvious solution was often the most dangerous deception. She decided to pay a morning call on Dr. and Mrs. Fielding, ostensibly to inquire after Iris Fielding's health, which had seemed particularly fragile since the discovery of Miss Eleanor's diary. As she approached their well-maintained cottage, Miss Marple noted the stable block at the rear of the property, where 2 fine horses stood in their stalls. The familiar scent of hay and leather carried on the morning breeze, but now it held new significance in light of Mrs. Hartwell's observation about saddle soap in Miss Eleanor's drawing-room. Iris Fielding received her visitor in the sun-filled morning-room, her hands clasped tightly around the same beaded reticules she had carried at the village fete. Her usual composure appeared strained, and Miss Marple observed how her fingers unconsciously worried at the clasp whenever certain topics arose in conversation. "Such a dreadful business about poor Miss Eleanor," Iris began, her voice carrying a tremor that seemed to go beyond ordinary grief. "One wonders if her age had begun to affect her judgment, stirring up matters that were better left undisturbed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently as she settled into her chair. Indeed, she seemed quite preoccupied with the past in her final weeks. The diary entries mention her particular interest in Timothy Ashworth's accident and that curious reference to someone called Maisie. Such an unusual detail to remember after 40 years. The effect was immediate and telling. Iris Fielding's color drained visibly, and she rose abruptly to tend to a flower arrangement that required no attention. "Maisie? I'm afraid I don't recall anyone by that name from that time. Memory plays such tricks after so many years." Dr. Fielding entered at that moment, his professional bearing slightly ruffled by recent events. His eyes quickly assessed his wife's obvious distress before settling on Miss Marple with the careful attention of a man who recognized potential danger. "Miss Marple," he said with forced heartiness, "I trust you're not allowing village gossip to disturb your peace. These old tragedies have a way of growing in the telling, becoming far more mysterious than they ever were in reality." "How true," Miss Marple agreed mildly. Yet Miss Eleanor's inquiries seemed quite specific. She had been asking about old head injuries and their delayed effects, I understand. And she was particularly interested in that double-note whistle Major Whitcomb had taught Timothy for calling dogs. Iris Fielding's hand flew unconsciously to her throat, where the ghost of a blue ribbon might once have rested. The gesture was brief but unmistakable, and Miss Marple filed it away with the quiet efficiency that had made her reputation. "Timothy was always fond of animals," Iris said, her voice carefully controlled. Perhaps Miss Eleanor was simply reminiscing about happier times. "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, she was trying to understand why Timothy had gone to that particular lane, on that particular evening, at that particular time. A signal, perhaps. A prearranged meeting? The silence that followed seemed to press against the morning room's cheerful walls. Dr. Fielding poured himself a glass of water with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, while his wife stood frozen beside the flowers, her knuckles white where they gripped the vase. "Miss Marple," Dr. Fielding said finally, "I must ask you not to distress my wife with these speculations. Timothy Ashworth's death was thoroughly investigated at the time. The horse bolted, the boy was thrown, and that was the end of it." "So the official report concluded," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But Miss Eleanor's diary suggests she had developed rather different ideas. She spoke of making things right and facing the truth at last. She had even begun documenting her visitors' reactions when Timothy's name was mentioned, making careful notes about nervous gestures and revealing responses." At this, Iris Fielding turned sharply, her composure finally cracking. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That anyone could have—" She stopped abruptly, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's keen eyes had caught the bulge in Iris's reticule, more substantial than any handkerchief could account for. The faint scent of saddle soap seemed stronger in the morning room, clinging to Iris's tweed skirt and gloves with the persistence of recent contact. "I'm suggesting only that Miss Eleanor's memory remained remarkably clear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but inexorable. "She recalled, for instance, a young woman named Maisie who had been in service with the family, someone who cared deeply for Timothy, someone who might have arranged to meet him that evening, perhaps using a familiar signal he would trust." The color drained completely from Iris Fielding's face, and she swayed slightly against the table. Dr. Fielding moved quickly to support her, his own face grave with understanding of where Miss Marple's gentle questions were leading. "Margaret," he said quietly, using his wife's given name with the tenderness of long familiarity, "perhaps it's time." But Iris, Margaret, Maisie, straightened with sudden defiance, her eyes flashing with the spirit that had once made her notable in the village. Time for what? To be destroyed by the fantasies of a lonely old woman who could never forgive herself for dismissing a servant girl who dared to love above her station. The admission hung in the morning air like a confession, and Miss Marple understood that she was finally hearing the voice of the woman who had loved Timothy Ashworth 40 years ago, who had carried the weight of terrible secrets ever since, and who had killed again rather than let those secrets destroy the life she had built upon their foundation. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, she reflected that the most dangerous moment in any investigation came when long-buried truths finally struggled toward the light. The net was drawing tighter around the real killer, and she suspected that the final confrontation was now inevitable. The afternoon following her revelatory conversation with the Fieldings brought Miss Marple a curious sense of pieces shifting into place, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscured. As she walked home through the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, her mind worked methodically through the morning's discoveries. The name that had puzzled everyone, Maisie, was no longer a mystery. Margaret Iris Hayes had indeed existed, had worked in service at Ashworth House, and had become the respectable Mrs. Fielding through marriage. Yet this revelation, rather than simplifying matters, had opened new avenues of inquiry that led into darker territory than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Marple found herself drawn to visit the scene of the original tragedy, that winding lane where Timothy Ashworth had met his death 40 years earlier. The path was overgrown now, hedgerows thick with wild roses and brambles that had reclaimed much of the old cart track. It was a place made for secrets, she reflected, where a prearranged meeting could easily go unobserved by the casual passer-by. The double-note whistle that Major Whitcomb had mentioned would have carried clearly through the evening air, summoning Timothy to what he believed was a romantic assignation, but what had proved to be his death. As she approached the gnarled oak tree that marked the lane's midpoint, Miss Marple was surprised to encounter Mrs. Prowse, ostensibly gathering blackberries, though her basket remained conspicuously empty. The village gossip's presence in such a remote location struck Miss Marple as curious, particularly given the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from the woman's usually confident demeanor. "Such a mournful place, isn't it?" Mrs. Prowse declared with forced brightness. "Brings back all those old memories of poor Timothy. A tragic accident, that was. Never understood why Miss Eleanor started stirring it all up again." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Prowse's eyes darted repeatedly toward a patch of disturbed earth near the oak's exposed roots, as if something had recently been buried or unearthed there. The significance of this detail was not lost on someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of human anxiety and deception. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Hartwell provided another piece of the puzzle during what appeared to be a casual visit to return a borrowed book. The loyal housekeeper, still grieving for her mistress, spoke with the careful precision of someone who had been reconsidering old memories in light of recent events. "Miss Eleanor dismissed a maid 40 years ago," Mrs. Hartwell revealed, her voice heavy with remembered sorrow. "A bright girl everyone called Maisie. Margaret Hayes, she was. There had been a quarrel about house rules and a young man's attentions, and Miss Eleanor felt the situation had become impossible. The girl wore a blue ribbon with a little key, and there were promises made that couldn't be kept within the bounds of propriety. The housekeeper's account painted a picture of star-crossed lovers whose relationship had been severed by social convention and family duty. Timothy's death that very night had left Miss Eleanor carrying the burden of wondering whether her harsh decision had somehow contributed to the tragedy that followed. She never forgave herself," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "And when she began wearing that blue ribbon these past weeks, I knew she meant to end the silence at last. She had been asking questions about that double-note whistle. Had the major demonstrate it so she could be certain of the sound? She said there were 3 people she must speak to with the vicar present, so there would be no more mistakes." As evening approached, another significant detail emerged through the village's efficient gossip network. Iris Fielding had made an urgent visit to Miss Eleanor's cottage that morning, demanding to retrieve something Miss Eleanor had borrowed. When Mrs. Hartwell politely refused, citing the police seal on the deceased woman's belongings, Iris had grown visibly agitated, her eyes scanning the fireplace and writing desk with unmistakable desperation. Miss Marple settled into her evening chair with her knitting, her mind working as methodically as her needles. The various threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together into a pattern that was both more complex and more dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Eleanor's investigation had uncovered not merely an old romantic entanglement, but evidence of something far more sinister, a deliberate act of violence that had been concealed for 4 decades. The blue ribbon and its key, the distinctive sealing wax, the desperate attempts to retrieve or destroy evidence, and the nervous reactions of multiple villagers, all pointed to a conspiracy that extended beyond simple inheritance disputes. Someone in their peaceful community had killed Timothy Ashworth 40 years ago, and that same person had murdered Miss Eleanor to prevent the truth from finally coming to light. Inspector Morrison remained focused on building his case against Geoffrey Ashworth, but Miss Marple suspected that the young man's obvious guilt was serving as a convenient distraction from a more complex and deeply buried truth. The real killer had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years, protected by respectability and the natural reluctance of a small community to examine its darkest secrets too closely. As the village settled into its evening routine, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous moment in any investigation came when long-buried secrets finally began to surface. The net was drawing tighter around the true murderer, and she sensed that the final confrontation was now inevitable. The question was not merely who had killed Miss Eleanor, but who had killed Timothy Ashworth decades earlier, and whether that person would be driven to strike again rather than face exposure for crimes that had shaped an entire lifetime of deception. The secret of the unopened diary was proving to be far more treacherous than anyone had imagined, and Miss Marple knew that the village's peaceful facade was about to be shattered by revelations that someone had killed twice to keep hidden. The morning following Miss Marple's revelatory garden encounter brought developments that would fundamentally shift the investigation's trajectory. Mrs. Hartwell arrived at the vicarage before breakfast, clutching a blue-sealed envelope with hands that trembled from more than the morning chill. Inspector Morrison, who had been preparing his final report against Geoffrey Ashworth, found his certainty wavering as he examined this unexpected piece of evidence. The envelope bore the same distinctive deep blue wax that had become central to their investigation, but more significantly, the seal showed a tiny chip along its lower edge, a flaw that would prove traceable to its source. The message within was brief but chilling in its desperation. Burn what remains in the grate. Say nothing of any visitor. The whistle means nothing. Forget the ribbon and all questions about it. Miss Marple, arriving with her usual impeccable timing under the pretense of delivering fresh scones to Mrs. Clement, observed the faint but unmistakable scent of saddle soap that clung to the paper. The threatening tone marked a significant departure from the careful planning that had characterized the murders, suggesting someone driven to increasingly desperate measures as the investigation closed in. Panic, she murmured to Inspector Morrison as they examined the evidence, belongs to those whose carefully constructed world is beginning to crumble. This letter represents a loss of control that may prove most illuminating. The mornings. Revelations continued when young Tommy Finch appeared at the vicarage, his face flushed with excitement and guilt in equal measure. The boy had returned to the disturbed earth near the old oak tree, driven by curiosity that had overcome his fear of adult disapproval. What he had unearthed from the shallow hiding place would prove to be the physical evidence that tied the present investigation directly to the 40-year-old tragedy. The small biscuit tin contained 3 items that spoke eloquently of love, betrayal, and murder. A frayed blue ribbon identical to the one Miss Eleanor had worn in her final weeks, a small metal whistle tarnished with age, and a folded note whose edges had browned but whose message remained heartbreakingly clear. Dearest T, double call at dusk by the oak. All is arranged. Do not fail me. M. Inspector Morrison handled these artifacts with the reverence due to evidence that could reshape an entire case. The whistle, when tested, produced the distinctive double note that Major Whitcomb had taught Timothy for calling dogs. More significantly, the ribbon bore traces of a small key's impression, suggesting it had once held the very key that had unlocked Miss Eleanor's diary. Major Whitcomb, summoned to examine the whistle, confirmed its authenticity with obvious reluctance. His military bearing seemed diminished as he turned the instrument over in his weathered hands. And Miss Marple observed how his usual bluster gave way to something approaching genuine distress. I saw someone that night, he admitted finally, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years' guilt. Walking toward the lane just before dusk, moving with purpose rather than the hesitation one might expect from a dismissed servant girl. The build was right for Maisie, the general appearance, but there was something about the bearing that seemed different. More confident, more determined. This testimony provided the crucial link Miss Marple had been seeking. Someone had indeed used Timothy's love for Maisie as bait, luring him to his death with a forged note and the familiar whistle signal. But the identity of that someone remained carefully obscured behind years of deception and the natural reluctance of witnesses to trust memories that had grown uncertain with time. The afternoon brought Miss Marple's most delicate challenge, the psychological testing that would force the killer to reveal themselves through their own reactions. She arranged what appeared to be a casual tea gathering, ostensibly to discuss the proper disposition of Miss Eleanor's belongings now that the investigation was drawing to a close. Her invitation included the Fieldings, Mrs. Prowse, and Major Whitcomb, all those whose names had appeared in Miss Eleanor's careful documentation. As her guests settled into the familiar comfort of her parlor, Miss Marple began her gentle interrogation with the skill of someone who understood that the most dangerous truths often emerged through seemingly innocent conversation. She spoke of Miss Eleanor's final weeks, her growing preoccupation with the past, and her determination to make things right before it was too late. She had become quite convinced, Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles clicking steadily, that Timothy's death was no accident. The whistle, you see, and the ribbon, and the careful timing of events. Someone had used his love for Maisie to orchestrate his death. Someone who knew about their planned elopement and had compelling reasons to prevent it. The effect was immediate and telling. Iris Fielding's teacup rattled against its saucer, her face draining of color as she struggled to maintain composure. Mrs. Prowse leaned forward with obvious fascination, while Major Whitcomb's military posture seemed to sag under the weight of remembered guilt. The most interesting aspect, Miss Marple continued, was Miss Eleanor's discovery of the sealing stamp. You see, she had found it among her late brother's effects, a small oval seal with a distinctive chip along the border. She had been testing samples of wax, comparing them to fragments found in various locations, when she realized that someone in our village had been using that very stamp for recent correspondence. Dr. Fielding shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional composure cracking as he glanced toward his wife. Iris Fielding had gone completely still, her hands frozen around her reticule as if it contained something too dangerous to release. The revelation of the sealing stamp's discovery was Miss Marple's masterstroke, a detail that would force the killer to choose between confession and another desperate act of violence. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across her parlor, she prepared for the final confrontation that would expose not only Miss Eleanor's murderer, but the truth about Timothy Ashworth's death that had been buried for 40 years. The secret of the unopened diary was finally ready to reveal its most dangerous truth, and Miss Marple knew that the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead was about to be shattered forever by revelations that someone had killed twice to keep hidden. The tension in Miss Marple's parlor had crystallized into something almost tangible, the afternoon light seeming to press against the windows as her carefully orchestrated gathering approached its most dangerous moment. The mention of the sealing stamp with its distinctive chip had produced exactly the reaction she had anticipated, and now she watched with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most crucial revelations often emerged through the smallest cracks in a carefully constructed facade. The stamp proved most illuminating, Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle conversational tone while her keen eyes observed every nuance of her guests' reactions. Miss Eleanor had discovered it among her late brother's effects and had been conducting her own experiments, comparing the impression it made with various fragments of blue wax she had collected. The match was quite unmistakable, particularly that distinctive chip along the lower edge. Iris Fielding's teacup rattled against its saucer with increasing violence until she was forced to set it down entirely. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, had developed a pronounced tremor that extended to her voice when she finally spoke. "I don't see what relevance ancient sealing stamps could have to poor Miss Eleanor's death," Iris said, but her protest lacked conviction. Her reticule, which she had clutched throughout the afternoon like a lifeline, now seemed to weigh heavily in her lap. "Oh, but they have considerable relevance," Miss Marple replied, rising with the unhurried movements of someone who had reached a predetermined conclusion. "Perhaps we might conduct a small experiment. I find that practical demonstrations often clarify matters that seem obscure in theory." She moved to her writing desk and withdrew a stick of deep blue sealing wax, the same distinctive shade that had featured so prominently in their investigation. "I wonder if we might each attempt to make a proper seal. It's quite an art, really, requiring steady hands and familiarity with the process." The suggestion was made so innocently that refusal would have seemed churlish. Major Whitcomb accepted the challenge with military precision, producing a neat, competent seal using the back of a teaspoon. Mrs. Prowse fussed and dripped, creating a lopsided impression while apologizing for her nervous condition. Dr. Fielding's attempt was methodical and professional, though Miss Marple noticed how he avoided meeting anyone's eyes during the process. When the materials reached Iris Fielding, her composure finally began to fracture. She hesitated so long that the candle flame guttered, requiring relighting. As she leaned forward to attempt the seal, her reticule slipped from her lap, spilling its contents across Miss Marple's Persian carpet in a cascade of damning evidence. The brass key attached to its frayed blue ribbon landed first, followed by several sticks of the distinctive blue wax, and finally, most devastating of all, the small oval sealing stamp with its telltale chip along the lower edge. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Iris's sharp intake of breath and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. "Margaret," Dr. Fielding whispered, using his wife's given name with the tenderness of someone who suddenly understood the full scope of what he was witnessing. His face had gone gray with the horrible realization that the woman he had loved for 38 years had been carrying secrets that could destroy everything they had built together. But Miss Marple's attention was focused entirely on the transformation taking place before her eyes. The respectable Mrs. Fielding was dissolving, revealing someone altogether more complex and infinitely more dangerous. When Iris, finally, raised her head, her eyes held a defiance that surprised everyone present. "You don't understand," she said, her voice carrying a strength that had been carefully hidden for 4 decades. "None of you could possibly understand what it meant to love someone so completely that their happiness mattered more than your own life, even when that happiness threatened to destroy them utterly." Inspector Morrison, who had been summoned by Mrs. Clement and now stood quietly in the doorway, stepped forward with the measured authority of someone who recognized a confession beginning to unfold. Miss Marple gestured for him to wait, understanding that premature intervention might cause their quarry to retreat back into the protective shell of respectability that had served her so well for so many years. "Timothy Ashworth," Miss Marple said gently, "was indeed planning to elope with Maisie, the young servant girl who had been dismissed from his household. But someone else knew about their plans, someone who felt that such a union would be disastrous for all concerned." She paused, allowing the weight of implication to settle over the room. The double-note whistle that Major Whitcomb had so kindly taught Timothy was used that fateful evening, but not by Maisie herself. Someone else had learned the signal, someone who understood that Timothy would respond without question to what he believed was a summons from his beloved. Major Whitcomb, his military bearing finally cracking under the weight of 40 years' guilt, produced the tarnished whistle from his pocket with trembling hands. At Miss Marple's gentle nod, he raised it to his lips and produced the distinctive double note that had once called a young man to his death. The effect on Iris Fielding was immediate and devastating. She flinched as if struck, her carefully maintained composure shattering completely as the sound carried across the room like an echo from the distant past. In that moment, Miss Marple saw not the respectable doctor's wife, but the desperate young woman who had once stood in a moonlit lane using love as bait for murder. "The question that has puzzled me throughout this investigation," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but inexorable, "is not whether Maisie loved Timothy enough to meet him secretly, but whether someone else loved him enough to kill rather than see him make what they considered a ruinous mistake." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across her parlor, Miss Marple prepared for the final revelation that would expose not only Miss Eleanor's murderer, but the truth about a crime that had shaped an entire village's history for 40 years. The secret of the unopened diary was finally ready to reveal its most dangerous truth, and she knew that the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead was about to be shattered forever by revelations that someone had killed twice to keep hidden. The net was closing, and there would be no escape from the justice that had been 40 years in coming. The silence that followed the whistle's haunting double note seemed to stretch across 40 years, connecting that long-ago evening with this moment of revelation. Miss Marple observed how the sound affected each person in the room, but none more profoundly than Iris Fielding, whose carefully maintained composure finally shattered like glass striking stone. "You see," Miss Marple said with the gentle authority that had served her so well over the years, "the tragedy of this case lies not in greed or inheritance, but in the most dangerous kind of love, the love that believes it knows better than the beloved's own heart." She set down her knitting and regarded Iris with the compassionate understanding of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its complexity. Iris Fielding was never Maisie, the dismissed servant girl. Margaret Hayes, the real Maisie, left the village that morning 40 years ago and built a respectable life as a shopkeeper's wife in Market Belling, never knowing what had truly happened to the young man she loved. Inspector Morrison stepped closer, his notebook ready, but Miss Marple's raised hand suggested patience was still required. The full truth must emerge naturally, or it would remain forever incomplete. Iris was the housekeeper's daughter, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the weight of discovered truth. She grew up in Ashworth House alongside Timothy, watching over him with the fierce devotion of an older sister after his parents died. When she learned of his plans to elope with a servant girl, a match that would destroy his prospects and bring scandal to the family name, she made a desperate decision. Iris Fielding's hands trembled as she finally found her voice. "He was going to throw everything away," she whispered, her words carrying the pain of 4 decades. Timothy was barely 21, infatuated with a pretty face and romantic notions. The marriage would have ruined him socially, financially, completely. I couldn't let that happen to the boy I'd helped raise. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. "So you intercepted the real Maisie's note, learned her handwriting, and sent Timothy a message arranging to meet by the old oak tree. You knew the whistle signal Major Whitcomb had taught him, knew he would come without question, trusting completely in what he believed was a summons from his beloved." "I only meant to frighten him," Iris said, tears beginning to flow, "to make him see reason. I had prepared the horse, loosened the girth just enough that a sudden movement would cause the saddle to slip. I thought he would fall, perhaps be injured enough to abandon his foolish plans. But not." She stopped, unable to voice the word that had haunted her for 40 years. Dr. Fielding, his face ashen with the horrible realization of what he was hearing, reached toward his wife with trembling hands. "Margaret," he whispered, using her given name with the tenderness of long familiarity mixed with dawning horror. "The horse reared when I gave the whistle signal," Iris continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth finally emerged. "Timothy was thrown, struck his head on a stone. I ran to him, but it was too late. In my panic, I took the ribbon and key that Maisie had given him as a token, buried them with the forged note near the oak tree, and let everyone believe it was a tragic accident." Miss Marple's keen eyes observed how the confession brought both relief and anguish to the woman who had carried this burden for so long. And Miss Eleanor's investigation threatened to expose everything. Her diary entries, her careful documentation of reactions and inconsistencies, her discovery of the sealing stamp, all of it pointed toward the truth you had worked so hard to bury. She found the stamp among her brother's effects and began experimenting with different wax samples, Iris admitted. When she started wearing that blue ribbon, touching it whenever Timothy's name was mentioned, I knew she was remembering things she had tried to forget. The night she summoned me, she had 3 letters ready to send. To the vicar, to the constable, to the magistrate. She meant to expose everything. Inspector Morrison cleared his throat, finding his professional voice despite the emotional weight of the revelations. "Mrs. Fielding, you'll need to come with me. There will be formal charges for both deaths." As Iris was led away, her husband following with the broken steps of a man whose world had collapsed around him, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that had driven the entire case. The young woman who had killed to protect Timothy's future had instead destroyed it entirely, along with her own. Love, when twisted by pride and misguided certainty, could become the most destructive force imaginable. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead performed its ancient ritual of healing and forgetting. Mrs. Prowse, chastened by her proximity to such genuine tragedy, found herself speaking more softly about village affairs. Major Whitcomb quietly disposed of the whistle that had played such a crucial role in the murders, unable to bear the sight of it. Geoffrey Ashworth, cleared of all suspicion, departed for London with visible relief, leaving the village to process its secrets without his uncomfortable presence. Dr. Fielding continued his rounds with mechanical precision, his professional duties providing the only structure left in his shattered world. The village treated him with gentle courtesy, understanding that he too was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Miss Marple, settling into her evening chair with her knitting, reflected that the most dangerous secrets were often those born of love, rather than malice. The unopened diary had finally revealed its truth. Not a simple tale of greed or inheritance, but a complex tragedy of misguided devotion that had claimed 3 lives across 4 decades. As the familiar sounds of village evenings settled around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of conversation over garden gates, the gentle chiming of the church clock, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, though it brought no joy. The truth, however painful, had finally emerged from its 40-year burial, and with it came the possibility of peace for all those who had been touched by Timothy Ashworth's tragic fate. The secret of the unopened diary was secret no more, and St. Mary Mead, forever changed by its revelations, would slowly learn to live with the knowledge that even the most peaceful communities could harbor darkness deep enough to kill for. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that this was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that understanding the capacity for both love and evil that dwelt within every human heart was the beginning of true wisdom. The village slept, and in the morning, life would continue, marked forever by the truth that had finally come to light.